Welcome to another episode of the RESGEN Giving Life Podcast, where we hear stories and have conversations about life in Christ, everyday discipleship, and ways that we as men can give life to others. My name is Tom Henderson, the founder of RESGEN, and I'm so glad that you're tuning in today. Joining me in conversation is my friend, Joe Evenson. Joe is a husband, a father of four, a devoted follower of Christ, and the Chief Program Officer at Make-A-Wish South Dakota in Montana, where he helps create and provide life-changing wishes for children with critical illnesses. In addition to all of that, Joe also serves as the chaplain for our professional arena football team, the Sioux Falls Storm. On today's show, Joe and I discuss a number of topics, including what he learned from moving from player to coach to chaplain, and how a message from a University of Nebraska football coach helped change his view of masculinity. We also talk about how having a stroke at the young age of 34 led him to making the tough decision to leave the athletic world as a career and instead invest his life in the next generation of kids, college students, and men in different ways. I'm really looking forward to you hearing this episode. Here's my conversation with Joe Evenson. Joe Evenson, welcome to the podcast, brother.
Thanks, Tom.
Man, this is good. I'm excited just for us to have this little conversation and just bring, basically, what we do is we just bring a lot of the conversations like you and I would have at Bagel Boy. We just bring them right here and have a good time. So before we get into just kind of some specifics that I did mention that we're going to talk about, this is going to be a little intro of who you are to a lot of people. So just give a little introduction as to who Joe Evenson is.
Yeah. It's so funny when you ask me that question about a bio, because I literally told you I had to Google myself a little bit to come up with something, because that's not a question you get asked every day, right?
Yeah.
But just real quick background: from Evenson, South Dakota, born and raised. Graduated high school in 1998, moved on to Augustana University, went to school there.
Yeah.
Played college football. Football is a big part of my story, my background. And so that's a part of kind of the stuff we'll get into today.
Yeah.
But from there, I just went into coaching, played for the Storm a couple years, and just through a bunch of stuff that happened, kind of moved from coaching to education and now a nonprofit. So
yeah, that's
kind of the backstory in a quick nutshell. And then married to my wife, Tressie. Been married to her now for coming up on 18 years.
Oh,
got
man.
4 kids.
Four girls.
Well, I got 3 girls.
3 girls.
Boy, yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
I was wrong.
Yep.
I thought it was 4. My bad.
Yep. I got 4. You had the number right.
Okay.
I got 3 girls and then I got 1 boy. But I got twin girls that are my oldest. They're 12. I've got my son, Jordy. He's 8.
Okay.
And my youngest daughter, Raylan, she's 5.
Okay.
Yeah.
So twin girls, though.
Yeah.
And I mean, that was right out. I mean, you went from 0 kids to 2 kids. Right away.
Yeah, that was pretty radical. We don't have a lot of history of twins in our family, so I don't think anybody, if you're not trying, it's not like you're expecting to have twins.
Right.
So jaw-dropping moment when we were told we were having twins at 23 weeks. We were just battling to figure out what we were going to name our 1 kid. And then we find out we're having 2.
Yeah.
And yeah, it was just a radical shift.
Now, when your wife informed you that she was pregnant, Laura did it in a way where she brought me she visited me in my office and she dropped just set a pair of baby shoes on my desk. So when you found out, were there 2 sets of shoes that were put on your desk? Or
yeah. Well, the funny thing about that was, if you back it up, we did all kind of the checkups and the heart rates and that kind of stuff, and we kind of nonchalantly asked a question like, "Hey, if there were 2 in there, would you know this really?" And they said, we only got 1 heartbeat, so you guys are good. So we go in the ultrasound 23 weeks to figure out if we're having a boy or we having a girl. And that's when the ultrasound tech dropped the bomb of like, "Oh, congrats, you guys are having twins." And that was the first we heard of it. So that's how we knew. She found out the same way I did.
That's amazing. Yeah. That's just, somehow there's another heartbeat that just
somehow. It was just, they were in sync. They were together.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Okay, so born and raised in Evenson, South Dakota. So I mean, that's a small town.
Right.
I mean, it's probably grown a little bit since then. But so do you? I mean, now living in Sioux Falls, do you miss the small town at all, or not really?
Yeah, not really. But as an adult, I think that growing up so close to Sioux Falls, we always kind of considered Sioux Falls home.
Okay.
But then going to school here and then coming back here in 2007 after a small stint in Nebraska, I mean, this has always been considered home. But I do love the fact that close to home, so only about a 30-minute drive, so not too bad.
Yeah.
And then you know, for us, I think having the amenities of Sioux Falls and the bigger town, bigger community, I think is really appealing. But small town mentality, just the way we take care of each other is really fun. And now that we're having kids, we're kind of seeing that differently, right? So the way we grew up in a small town, you just did everything because that's the way it was.
Yeah.
And now our kids growing up here, just a little bit different, but overall we love Sioux Falls. Can't beat it.
So when you were growing up as a kid in small town, like you said, I mean, it was just everyone knew everybody. There's just this commitment to one another. And you were an athlete. So was sports pretty much your world?
It was.
As a high school kid? Yeah. And was that pretty much your identity, would you say?
100%.
Yeah.
You know, everything revolved around, there wasn't spring, winter, you know, fall. It was just football, basketball, track, baseball, whatever the sport was next. That was the season. And you were really kind of identified by how good you were. And right away, early on, just playing sports in the backyard and the playgrounds, I was always lucky enough to be one of the more gifted athletes. And so adults praised me for that. Other players looked at me and like just friends like, oh, you know, look at this guy. He's just a really good athlete. So it's almost like your spirit was lifted up. Your stature was lifted up. And I think that I really gravitated towards that and I liked it. I think just that significance was kind of a piece of kind of the growth there. It just made me buy into it. And so by the time I was in 8th grade, I was already starting on the varsity football team. And I was good, but it was kind of like small town.
Yeah.
You only got so many numbers to work with there. So who's the next guy up?
Yeah.
Well, here I was in 8th grade that I was ready to play at the varsity level. And so it was just kind of one thing after the other of like, well, he's pretty good. Let's move him up. Let's give him this. Let's do this. And I just thrived in that environment.
Yeah.
Because I was competitive. I loved it. And it was everything I did. It was kind of the way of the culture that I was born in, which was good and bad. Good that it allowed me to have an incredible work ethic, which that was from my home and that was from the community. As we looked at some of the older athletes, the things that they were doing. I remember 3rd grade, like, I don't know what most kids get for their Christmas present in 3rd grade, but I got a concrete weight set. And so that was who I was right away. It's like, I want to be like those guys.
At 3rd grade, you got your first.
I had this tiny little room, no bigger than your office, and I had a bed and I had a bench. That was it. You had to kind of walk around and get to the bed, but I was just the culture we were in. We just loved it.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, we do run into each other every so often at the gym, and I always know that I need to finish up my workout before you start yours because I always feel so much worse about myself after watching you work out because you are a beast in the weight room, and it's now that I know that you started at 3rd grade, I get it. Yeah, I get it. Yeah. That's crazy. Okay, so then was faith a part of your teen years at all, or was that did that come later on for you? Yeah, so it was not existent. You know, we went to Lutheran church, I would say periodically, and I would say consistently Christmas, Easter. We were kind of that family growing up. Yeah, the Creasters?
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, that was us.
Okay.
And we just didn't, it really wasn't real to me. It was something where I knew the Christmas story, I knew the Easter story, but to me it was almost like fiction. It was just like this kind of story that you would tell your kids. I didn't really have like that model in my life that was living it out. So there was no like real example for me to kind of look at. You know, when I bought into the culture of my community, it was really driven with sports. Yeah. And that was it. And so that really, as I look back, it was my God in a way of like how I worshiped that. But with faith, there was just not anything that seemed to be real to me at that time. So you graduate from high school. You go to Augustana, right down the road, and you are playing football, at a high level there at Augustana. You then graduate, then you go right into playing for the Storm. Is it right out of college? Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So when you went and played for the Storm, was that something that you would maybe hope that you were hoping that may even lead to the next level? And potentially, playing at even a higher level like the NFL or something like that? Or was it just more like, oh, this will be a good way to continue to stay in sports? Did you have coaching on your mindset at that time? Or what was your mindset going into when you played for the Storm? Yeah, so it's funny you ask because from my perspective, it was like that was my ceiling. And at that time, it was the NIFL. My goal was always to play in the NFL. But it was only one letter off. So it worked out all right. I felt pretty good about that. So indoor football, 3 years, and it was just an opportunity to continue my playing career, but just knew that it wasn't going to go anywhere else.
Okay.
It was kind of like the buffer between college and then what am I going to do with my life, pretty much. And it was awesome. But the interesting thing, like even with Augustana and for the Storm, was just at a point in my life where it seemed like I had a lot of direction in my life. There was a lot of people that were trying to pour into me, but there was nothing really long-term. It was like in the moment, like how can I be the best football player I can be? So there was nothing really after that, which was where the identity crisis was really created, because once that was kind of semi-taken away and the Storm really wasn't a great, I didn't know if it was going to be a real great fit. It was just kind of completely blank. I just had no idea what I was going to do. And I think that from high school to college to the Storm was kind of this evolution and this kind of development of just more independence, more kind of like worldly masculinity of what I was trying to create myself. And it just made me kind of just, there was just times where it got me further and further away from anything that I feel like would have been productive, because I was so self-driven to the point of selfishness, of only being about myself to impact maybe sports, and that was really it. So it was just a real crazy time. And when I say crazy, like just the way I was living, from college to then Storm, it was just, I didn't care. I just didn't care about anything else except living in the moment and what's best for me. And looking back, it just sounds so selfish, because what I've learned now 20 years later and just kind of reflecting back in those times, it's just really difficult to think that I was in those moments and just not really understanding like how the world was shaping me and how the world was kind of playing with me and just kind of moving me along. But yeah, it was just an interesting time of like looking back at that and just kind of remembering what it was like to be in those moments.
So how did you know after, like, okay, so after 3 years that it was that your time of playing football was done? Like, how did you know that
somehow? I saw some of the older guys, the vets that had been doing it for 6, 7 years, and it was almost the point where they would get pushed out because they didn't have what it took to make that team and just be as productive as they were once. So I told myself, like, I'm going to play 3 years, and if that's it, that's it. And if I can get a chance to move on, then I'm going to move on. And so luckily that last year I went in with the resolve of saying, this is it. My last year, no matter what, I'm going to push myself. I didn't have anything lined up afterwards, but I just kind of told myself, like, this is going to be the last year. And so luckily through, I think 3/4 of the way through that year, I was able to land a graduate assistant coaching position at Wayne State College in Nebraska. And so I got lucky. So that kind of, literally, we played the championship game. And then the next morning at 8 a.m., I was, actually about 6 a.m., I was driving to Wayne, Nebraska for the start of my coaching career.
Wow. So, I mean, you go from player at all the different levels and then right into coaching. Was that a tough transition though? Because all of a sudden, you know, you're the one that always used to have the helmet on, and now you're trying to, coach and, other, really they're kids, but I mean, they're college men. So was that harder of a transition than you thought it would be? It was
terrifying. It was so difficult because I just couldn't get over the fact that I was now the coach. From high school to college to even the Storm, I was always a captain or a leader of the team. And so I held that position with great honor. And now all of a sudden, I mean, everything in the matter of 24 hours was completely stripped away, and you literally flipped from player to coach. And that was it. There was no going back. And so that was a real tough transition of like the identity shift of, you're not an athlete anymore, you're not a football player, you are now a coach, and you're expected to lead these other football players the same way that your coaches led you. And the problem with that was I had some real hardcore coaches. And so I took on that identity along with no real spiritual development or leadership. And I took that to the 10th degree of how I coached the players now that I was in charge of. And it was really hard because I think that I almost took it out on players, just the anger and the bitterness and almost the identity crisis I was going through, because I was like, well, who am I now? Am I really a coach? Because I'm not a player anymore. I knew that, but it's like, this coaching thing, is this who I want to be? Is this kind of temporary, or what is it? And just the anger and all that, those emotions that came out. It was, I always had great relationships with players. I coached them hard, and I always felt like I was good with them as men, but it was just really kind of an interesting time of like just leadership.
Yeah, you had a lot of stuff going on in your own head and heart, and then you're trying to lead these guys, but trying to lead yourself at the same time. And so was that when kind of you'd say some of your faith journey started then? Was in that period of time?
Yeah. You know, I think the last year for the Storm, I'd got engaged. And so then my first year as a coach, we were living separate. So my wife, my fiance at the time, was living here in Sioux Falls. I was in Wayne, Nebraska, for about 2.5 hours difference. So we literally got engaged the night before I left to go to Wayne. I remember going and buying the ring and going back to my apartment because I wrote a check back when you could write checks. Yeah, it was a legit thing. And I didn't have enough to cover it. So I go back to the house and I am literally lifting up couch cushions to grab change and put all this in a jar, and I covered it by about $15. So going into my GA position, I had $15 to my name after I paid for the ring. But we got engaged, and then a year later we got married. And so she was away from me the first year, and the second year she came down.
Wow.
And it was just such an interesting time of just like that transition of not only am I not a player anymore, but now I'm a coach. And I'm soon to be married, and Mr. and Mrs. Joe Evenson, and just kind of that whole shift too, and just who was I going to be as a husband. So now I was taking on a completely different identity to, you know, these questions of the identity crisis and masculinity and who am I going to become now that I'm married. So just a lot of different things that were going on. But, you know, I didn't have a faith to me at all. Like, it just seemed like things continued to grow further and further off the tracks the more I got away from even high school. From college to Storm and now into my coaching career, you know, there still wasn't that model. There was nobody there that I could really see live out their faith on a daily basis. And I remember my second year down there coaching, my wife, she had tried to get me to go to church, and I just was not feeling it, didn't want to do it. I was like, no, I don't want to go to church. Like, I just didn't feel like at that moment I could be accepted. I didn't feel like that was the right thing for me based on the way I was living my life. And I just feel like, you know, in that time, I was like, I didn't feel like God could forgive me. I didn't feel like he could accept me. I just didn't feel like the church was for me. Like, it was kind of this club where the door was shut for guys like me. And it was just radical what kind of transition, because as a young coach, like most like other professions, like you have to get connected in order to move up. And so our head coach at the time, he spent some time in Nebraska. He got to know a guy by the name of Coach Ron Brown. And I'd never known this guy before, but he told us in staff meeting that he was going to be coming to speak to the whole athletics department and all the players. And so, you know, go there and try to be there if you can. And afterwards, we'll try to introduce you. Well, that was the only thing I was interested in. I didn't know he was FCA. I didn't know he was a Christian. I knew he was a coach in Nebraska that I wanted to get connected to.
Okay, so you wanted to connect with him just for the sole purpose of, like you said, networking.
Right, exactly.
For the potential of moving up in the coaching world.
Yeah.
So that was how that's why you were excited to go and hear from this dude. Yeah. And that's the mindset that you went in, but the Lord had something different.
And it was funny because I learned that it was an FCA event, and I'd known about FCA from my time at Augie. And it was a group that I just despised. I just didn't understand, like, back then how you would have to rely on a faith to be a good football player. And it's such awful thinking, but that's who I was in that moment.
Yeah.
So when I heard it was FCA, I'm like, oh, do I really want to go to this? And so I kind of remember, like, not wanting anybody to see me come into this gym. So it was this big gymnasium, packed. So I kind of knew my way around. So I literally went kind of underground, outside, and then up to the top to come in so nobody would see me. And I was at this top upper right corner. And so I was just kind of hanging out there by myself. And I just, for whatever reason, like, there were some things that he started to talk about that just started to resonate with me. And he started talking to these young student athletes. That was where the message was directed, about how to be strong, how to be tough, and what masculinity was all about. And it was more driven towards the toughness of, you know, saying no to drugs, saying no to alcohol, not going to parties, abstaining from sex, and all these things where it was completely opposite of what I thought masculinity was about. And he was calling those things weakness, and he was flipping it upside down and saying, no, you got it backwards, because these things that I'm talking about, this is Christ-centered toughness and masculinity of doing these things. And it just completely deconstructed my identity of masculinity within the matter of minutes.
Wow. And, you know, the thing that's so great about Coach Brown is because we had him as a part of our men's lunch last year when we hosted the RESGEN men's lunch that you were at. But, you know, I'm sure that the message that he shared was in a way that was very passionate, very loud, very in your face, but yet was that you just knew it was truth. And so as you were listening to him, you kind of felt like, wow, this is so much different than I, you know, thought Christianity was. That so did you feel like God was speaking to you pretty loudly at that time?
Oh, for sure. And yeah, for the listeners who've heard Ron Brown, I mean, the guy is very bold and passionate with the way he speaks.
Yeah.
And so when I'm up in that corner, even though I was as far away as I could be, he was speaking like in my face directly to me.
Yeah.
And I remember when he did an altar call at the end of his speech, without hesitation, I mean, I just like floated down to the court almost in front of everybody and just took a knee and accepted Jesus.
Yeah.
And I remember that feeling of just being so convicted when I wasn't even trying to receive the message, but I couldn't help but to listen. And then all of a sudden, I mean, it was just captivating. And just the conviction that just led me to say, this guy's right. He's absolutely right. And I'm wrong. Like how often do we admit that?
Right.
And I just said, I gotta learn more about faith and God and Jesus and the Bible. And it was just kind of this beginning. And I was so convicted that afterwards, like, I wanted to meet him, but it wasn't for the original intended purpose.
Yeah.
Like, I met him, and I talked specifically about, you know, I remember asking him, like, man, this is just such an amazing message. I want this to be real in my life, but, you know, how do I prioritize this? Because I talked to him coach to coach, and the grind was real, and we were putting in so many hours, and it was just like, how do I build this in? And just the kind of a conversation that we had about that. But like my intended purpose of going there versus what I left with was, I mean, how do you even equate that?
Yeah.
You know?
That's such a great story, Joe. And there's a couple of things that I just absolutely love. Even just in how you got into the room, like you didn't want to be seen going in there. You know, you kind of snuck in the back. You went up to the way top. But then I love how you said that when he gave the call to respond to the gospel, you just right in front of everybody, you know, it wasn't about like, okay, I don't want to be seen anymore. You're like, it doesn't matter because I've been seen by the Lord, and you want to go down there and say, and then the other thing that I just love about that is that he said, I want this to make a difference. I want this to be real. And I really want to just have this be a starting point to understanding what does it look like to live for Christ with this whole new mindset, this whole new view of masculinity. So what did that look like for you as far as like, because I think that oftentimes, you know, people will say like, man, I want to make a decision, or I did make a decision, but what do I do after that? So what did that look like for you?
Well, it was kind of interesting because it was a direct moment in my life where I gave myself to Jesus, but I don't feel like giving and committing were the same for me at that time.
Yeah.
Because the feeling was there, and I know it rattled me and it kind of moved me in the direction that God wanted me to, but I don't feel like with my time there was a great commitment to then moving forward on that. Because for me, what really happened, and I'll kind of fast forward, was I got back into the grind. Nobody there to really live it out in front of me, to be the example. And so I kind of fell back into this rut of, well, this is what I'm going to do because it's what everybody else around me is doing. And I think the only change that happened back then is I told my wife that, hey, there's something different about me. Like immediately I could feel the change, and we decided to start going to church because I said, that's the only thing I know what to do with this. Let's go to church. She had asked me, and so I said, let's do it.
Yeah. She's probably excited about that because she wanted you to go to church in the past. So
right. So that was the first step. And then we don't understand in the moment how God works. I don't. But reflecting back, we can see clearly some of the steps that he takes. And so as I was done with my grad assistant work, got my master's and was ready to move on, I was throwing resumes all over. And I was getting some interest from schools in the East Coast, down south, Midwest. I mean, they were all over. And so any one of those that would have accepted me, or some jobs that I got offered that I would have taken my life in a completely different direction. So who knows where God would have taken me or got me, like in one of those paths. But the randomness for a job to open up when it did at Augustana.
Yeah.
And for me to get the call when I was pretty much had given up on getting a job and said, I'm just going to stay here and volunteer. I mean, it was unreal. Like I remember getting the call and saying, hey, can you be up here tomorrow for an interview? I was like, absolutely. You know, just super excited, and did the interview, got the job. And they said, we're starting spring ball tomorrow. So here's the playbook, you know, let's go. But the grind was like, you know, that's not a shocker. We're going to get into it. But what happened was, like, I didn't really know the dynamics of the staff at the time, but the head coach, the guy that hired me, was Brad Salem. And Brad was a strong Christian leader, good man of faith. And when I saw him on a daily basis, like in the huddles, working with him in the office, like constantly in his faith, that was a game changer for me. Him and another guy by the name of John Smchenko.
Yeah.
And we were all coaching together. We were on the offensive side of the ball together. And I just saw the daily praying and the carrying of Bibles and just the way that they'd carry themselves, how they spoke. And that was for the first time in my life that it became real. And Coach Salem and John, they would invite me into these huddles and these, Bible studies. And I was too afraid to say yes, because I just didn't think, like, I had no background and I just didn't really ever pick up a Bible. So it's like, I'm not doing it. But thank God they were persistent. And one day I finally said yes. Said, yeah, let me get into this. And I remember telling them specifically, I said, don't call on me. Don't ask me any questions. I just want to sit back here and just listen. So I was pretty stern on that. And that to me is where things really, really shifted, because I remember paying attention and listening to everything going on, but only one thing stood out. For some reason, they brought up scripture, and it's in Psalms, it's in Proverbs, but the beginning of wisdom, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom.
Yeah.
And that's what captivated me. And when I walked out of that meeting, I remember John asked me, like, hey, are you all right? And I wasn't, because it was at that moment that I realized that I don't know God and I need to get to know him. And the fear of the Lord at that time meant a lot different things to me than it does now. But I just realized, like, I need to pick up the Bible. I need to start reading and understanding who God is and who I am in Jesus.
Yeah.
And from there on out, I mean, it was just 0 to 60. And I can't explain all the things that had happened from then to now of just the changes, because I think what the apprehension was before that was I just didn't want to give things up.
Yeah.
I didn't want to give up drinking, partying, and I was even into drugs a little bit. And I didn't want to give up my language. I had really foul language with the way I coached, and I just didn't want to give any of that up, because I thought, if I'm going to say I'm a Christian, I can't do those things. And what happened was I didn't really give them up. God just got into my heart and my spirit and just moved those just out of the way. It was just, it's so hard to explain how that worked, because it was so much who I was. My language, my habits, all that stuff, just God just
and a lot of times it does feel like that it's kind of daunting, because you feel like, man, I'd have to give up all this stuff all at the same time. But what we realize, and I get that. I mean, because that's just what you knew. That was just part of just who you were at that time. And why wouldn't you be that way, right? I mean, I think that's one of the things that as believers, sometimes, we can even look at other people and go, man, why are they making such poor decisions? Well, they're making decisions like that because, I mean, why wouldn't they, right? I mean, God has a different standard that he wants us to live, but if we're not walking with the Lord, then why would we assume that anybody's going to live according to those standards? And then even those standards, those are things that we just begin to learn as God begins to change us from the inside out. Now, we're never perfect, right? I mean, perfection is not something that we ever reach, but it's as we just continue to walk with the Lord, as he continues to give us grace, as we continue to give him more and more of our lives, and ask him for the power of the Holy Spirit to just guide us and continue to transform our lives, all of a sudden we look back and go, man, I really am different. And God really has made a huge difference in our life.
Yeah. And it was almost like this transformation of false masculinity to true masculinity. And it was these things that God was taking away that I used to cling on to, of like, hey, this is who I am. And this is how people that knew me from my old self, that's how they would identify me. And God just started taking every single one of those away.
Yeah.
And just shifting them out, saying, you are a new creation. In me, you will be different. 2 Corinthians 5:17.
Yeah.
It's just, in Jesus, we're a new creation. It's unbelievable. I never thought I could ever do that.
Yeah.
I never thought that I ever could be accepted or be the new creation through Jesus. But what he did through the power of the Holy Spirit is just, it's unbelievable how that worked. Because I thought I had to do it. I had to give this up. I had to quit doing this.
Mm-hmm.
But once I got into the Word and I got around other godly men, and I was trying to live that life and trying to be committed to it, I mean, God did the work. I didn't do it. And so it was that radical transformation of accepting that and trying to trust what God was trying to do now in my life, which was way different from anything I was trying to do.
Yeah. Oh, that's so good. That's so good. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about as well, it's just about another key, I guess, for lack of a better word, just kind of, it's a real key thing that happened in your life about 10 years ago. That really was something that that kind of just had you say, okay, look, there's something else, there's something different ahead for me, you know, and that was a bit of a health scare that you had 10 years ago.
Yeah.
So talk about that, and you were coming home from a trip, and you felt something wasn't right.
Yeah. And I'll even back it up a little bit to that, because what's interesting about my coaching career was it's almost like God knew that was his way of reaching me.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I'd started back at Augie, that was in 2007. Now what happened next was in 2013. And what happened was we were coming back from this trip up to North Dakota State, back in the grind, back in the road, trying to get better. And I'd come home from a long trip, and I was walking up to the house, and all of a sudden I'd take a step with my right foot, and my right side just drops, just goes heavy, kind of numb. Kind of almost that feeling like if you fall asleep and you're sleeping wrong, like double kinks in the arm and the leg. So I kind of was like, it's kind of weird, but I guess I can fight through it. Walk up my stairs, and I go to put my key into the lock, and I just couldn't do it. My motor function was kind of off, so I had to grab my hand and put it in there and got it in there. And so I unlocked the door, and then I walked into the house. Well, as men, we got this, right? So I am not going to tell anybody what's going on. I'm like, I'm okay. I'm going to fight through this.
Yeah.
And it wasn't debilitating at that point, but it was just kind of like scary. I'm like, what is going on here? And so that night I kind of fought through it and just said, I'm going to sleep it off. Well, the next morning I wake up, and the second my eyes open, I could just feel my whole right side at this point was completely gone. And my wife was up at the time feeding our young daughters at the time, who I think were between 2 and 3 years old. And so it was like 6:30 in the morning, and I'm like, in my mind, I could think clearly, and I couldn't speak. So I couldn't yell and scream or tell her to come get me. So I had to kind of like heave myself off the bed. And then I kind of worked myself up on my left side, and I leaned into my wall on the right, and I just kind of worked my way out into the living room. And then she could tell right away there was something going on.
Yeah.
And we both kind of just looked at each other, and it was, I don't even know what words were spoken or what kind of mumbling was going on, but she knew right away. Packed the kids up, jump in the car, go down 26th Street right to the hospital, go into the ER, and then within minutes they brought me up into the stroke unit, and things moved so fast. And as all this stuff was happening, I remember just sitting there just talking to God. I'm like, God, whatever you're going to do with me, just don't kill me. It was almost like one of those moments where it's like, I don't know if I'm going to pull through this.
Mm-hmm.
Like, part of my identity that I still clung to was just being like fit and being athletic, and kind of still going back to my player mentality of like, I'm an athlete.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just a moment where that was completely stripped away. And I was like, if I don't come back from this, then who am I then? Mm-hmm. So it was almost like this quasi identity crisis again that I'm going through with this health scare. And so I got checked into the stroke unit. They're running every test imaginable, because they're like, what is this healthy, 34-year-old?
Yeah.
What's he doing up here? And so they found a clot in my right calf, which they feel like was probably the purpose of the stroke, but they can't link the two specifically. But they showed the tiny little dot where the stroke happened, and it was just so minute. So they did the CT scans, blood draws, all those tests, and that's what they found out. And so I remember just being up in that room, and I could not do, like 24 hours ago, I was fully functional. I could do anything that I would want to do. And then in that moment, I couldn't speak clearly. I mean, I couldn't really even mumble. My right side was gone, so I couldn't even walk on my own. Like, couldn't even walk.
Yeah.
Couldn't write. I remember trying to, like, occupational therapy was trying to work with me, and I just couldn't put a pen to paper and just even put words or letters together. And when I was walking, they would get me up and they'd put the strap around my waist. Team of 4 nurses just get down the hall and back. 2 on the side, 1 in the front and the back. And it was just, I remember just like in my head, like just being so scared because I was like, I don't know if I'm going to pull through this. But in my head, I felt like I was going to be all right. So there was kind of like a calming presence, even amongst the fear of like what was to come.
Yeah.
And so that was 2 days. And, you know, on the 3rd day, I remember waking up and just all of a sudden, like my eyes open and I'm like, okay, I think I feel a little bit more clear today. Like, let's test this out. And I think I was telling you that I remember just standing up. Hey, that feels pretty good. You know, kind of just bouncing around. Like, that feels all right. Yeah. Dropping to the floor, doing 20 push-ups. I'm like, you know, what in the world? And then grabbing a pen and like just testing all these things out. Yeah. You know, getting my wife in there and talking to her and like, I feel pretty good. Like everything came back. Yeah. Yeah. And I just knew at that moment that there was something else going on there. And I remember having the talk with my wife, and we didn't come up with some great game plan about what we're going to do next, but I just told her, I said, I'm done, coach. I just can't do it anymore.
So do you feel like that, that was just something that, like, that was a change that you wanted to make because of the stroke, or was that what prompted it?
So physically, medicine-wise, they've said, you know, if you're good to go, you can go right back to coach. Yeah. So there was nothing that they would prevent me or be a health risk to coaching. Yeah. But for me, I just felt like this was a wake-up call and kind of a sign of like, I did what I need to do with you in coaching, and now I've got other plans that you're not going to know what they are, but you've got some other business for me to do. And it just was kind of a moment where we both felt like it was the right move, and it was a scary move because at that age, we'd had our twin girls, mortgage, college loans to pay back, all the bills and all that stuff with no plan how we're going to move forward. So at that point was probably the first time that I fully trusted in God's plan of like, all right, what are we going to do here? Because I don't have a plan. I can't put something down and saying this is what I'm going to do next because I have no clue.
And through that process, you saw God's faithfulness in a whole different way. Yeah. And, you know, you went from investing in the next generation of men and in you know, athletes and trying to get them to understand that, yes, you need to be a great football player, but also, you know, great men, to now investing in the younger generation. I mean, really in many different ways and in ways that God continues to use you. Yeah. And so I want to talk about, first of all, that's just a crazy story, because no one thinks at age 33, 34 years old that's going to be part of your story, you know, and just the feeling of laying in that bed and going, I mean, realizing you're not in control, and you have no ability to determine what the outcome is going to be. And I think there's such a powerful thing, I think, that for, especially as men, like when we realize, man, there's so much that's outside of our control. Right. And I mean, and I don't know about you, but sometimes I really try to control stuff. I like to cling on to things, you know, and, but it's moments like those that we realize, wow, you know what? We really are, in the Lord's hands. And these are things that we just cannot control this. And so, you know, and what a powerful thing to be able to even just at that point saying, man, I don't know what we're going to do, but we're going to trust God as we step out and see what He has for us next. So, so that's pretty awesome. So right now, I mean, so now you're serving as the senior director, right? Chief director of program services, or is that the role at Make-A-Wish South Dakota in Montana?
Evolved. Right now it's chief program officer. Okay. Yeah. And that's really kind of a fancy title for overseeing wishes, but we're a small nonprofit, so we really work hand in hand with making these things come true.
Yeah. And, you know, I got to tell you that, you know, when you see it, and just to let you know too, like my nephew, is a Make-A-Wish kid.
Oh.
So my sister and brother-in-law's son, Colton, is a Make-A-Wish kid.
Okay.
And so his wish was granted several years ago, and they were provided a camper because he has 1p36 deletion syndrome, and so travel's very, very difficult. Can't get on a plane, anything like that. So family vacations are very difficult. And so, but they were given this camper that they were able to go and actually do family vacations with. And it's just really a beautiful thing. And I mean, you see stories after story after story, week after week, you see these. And I mean, emotionally, it must be so powerful to see these wishes granted and what it does for that child and for that family. Yeah. Just this weekend, WrestleMania was on this weekend. And so we tuned that on the Peacock for a little bit to watch some of that. And at the beginning of it, they did this whole story about Make-A-Wish kids and how many, like the WWE has granted like 600 or 6,000, just crazy amount. And they brought all these kids out, and John Cena's giving them all 5. And I was crying. I'm not kidding. I was in my living room, Joe, crying as I'm watching John Cena give all these kids 5, right? And he came out and all the crowd's like cheering for him, and he didn't care about anything going on out there. I mean, he got on his knees and was like eye to eye with all these kids, and I get emotional even just think about it now. But I just think this has to be such a powerful thing for you to be a part of on a daily basis. Yeah.
The radical plan God has that we have no clue what's next. I mean, never in a million years would I ever thought that I'm in the position that I'm in.
Yeah.
There's not a direct career path to this position. There's not a direct education to it. It really came out of the blue. So I was completely blessed to have an opportunity to serve in this role that I've been in for now 7 years.
Yeah.
But I remember just some realizations of when I started. So I started at my job October 2015. And when we start out 2 days in the office, and then every 5 years we do a conference at Disney. So we're doing Disneyland that year. So we go off 2 days in the office and we go off to Disneyland for our conference. And we get into these huge ballrooms and we go in there. And I'm really pretty fresh, pretty green, don't know what's going on yet. And this whole ballroom is filled with round tables. And in the middle of the round tables, like you would see like fancy flowers or some kind of piece, but the round tables had tissue boxes in the middle of them. And I remember thinking how odd that was, because I'm like, is it allergy season, or what are these tissue boxes doing out here? And then they rolled the first video, and everybody, just the whole place, like thousands of people just crying their eyes out.
Yeah.
And of course, at that point, I'm trying to fight back the tears because, I'm still new and fresh, and I got that tough masculinity. I'm just like, good Lord, like, what am I getting into? Like, I'm going to be the one that's helping make these wishes come true. And I remember just lifting it up to God. Like, God, I can't do this.
Yeah.
Like, only through you can you help me to push through this, to work with these kids and these families and their stories. Because the mission, it's pretty clear what we do. And it's together we create life-changing wishes for children with critical illnesses. And to say that you're going to be a part of that and you're going to help move that forward in these kids' wish journeys is just, it was a heavy weight to start. But through the years, I've learned the process and learned to work with families and just started to understand their stories. And I think that's where it all starts for us. Much like anything else, we're trying to get to know somebody or something, of just understanding the people we're trying to serve. And, we really don't meet a need per se. We really want to offer something where we know the families are going through a lot. And we always kind of put it like, nobody chooses after their kids, the treatments and the diagnosis and all the things going forward. And so that power of choice is really stripped away from them in just one moment of diagnosis. This is your plan going forward. So everything these families knew as normal, going on vacations, going for walks or doing activities, going to school, all that gets taken away. We've seen families that have had to move for up to a year and a half to go to other cities where they get treatment. And so everything then becomes remote, and it's just really radical to be brought into those stories. But to then understand them of like, well, why do we exist? We know a wish is a good thing, but we've created more of a wish journey instead of just the wish in itself. And so we bring community to the table. They're going to support that kid and that family throughout their entire time with us. And the way we explain it to them is we work with kids 2.5 to 18 years old, and within reason, that kid is really in charge of the journey. So they are the CEO of their own wish. They really are in charge when it works with their condition.
Yeah.
And we get to engage them and empower them. And sometimes that is the family making those decisions. So they're engaged and they're empowered to really help make the decision of what is the best wish in this case. And the way that we shift it is we understand the medical journey that got to this point, and now we want to give you the power of choice back to feel like you have a little bit of control, because the wish journey is all about what you want, how you want it, within the reasons of, why we're doing what we do.
Yeah.
And so the journey that takes place when they come to us is really pretty amazing, because they get to choose that, not only like what the end result is of the wish, but then how do they get there? So it's pretty amazing. Anything from a camper to John Cena, to
Disney World,
to Disney, to shopping sprees. I mean, I've learned more things than I ever thought I would based on what these kids want, from the 3-year-old boy to the 15-year-old girl, 18-year-old girls to 10-year-old boys. I mean, it's such a wide variety.
And and I know that you really look at it as a way to minister to families. That's your heart. Your heart is so focused on just ministry, and whatever platform God has given you, you're going to use it for His glory and for His kingdom work. And so I just think, you are just really making a difference. I mean, you really are in those kids and those families. And so it's really cool to see. And I think God has you in that role right now, and has allowed you to thrive in that for 7 years now, and however long for the foreseeable future, that God's going to continue to use you in that way. That's pretty awesome. Another way that God has really used your background for kingdom work is the role that you have still with the Sioux Falls Storm. And so as we get ready to kind of end our conversation here in a few minutes, I just want to talk about just you and I are both football chaplains. I'm for the University of Sioux Falls football team, and you're the chaplain for the Storm. So what's it like being the chaplain for these men that you used to be one of them, suiting up, playing on that team. What's it been like being the chaplain for these guys now?
Well, first of all, backing it up to when I was a player, I would have steered as far clear away from the team chaplain as possible, because the way I was living my life, I was like, I don't want anything to do with that. So a guy that I told my story to said, God had to put you back into the craziest time of your life to then lead those men that are going through the same things that you went through with no direction whatsoever. And so the way this came up was completely radical in itself, because the head coach wanted me to coach. And so we were kind of having conversations, and the job was basically mine, and he was waiting for me to make a decision. And I kept telling him, I was like, I don't feel like coaching is right. I'm not shutting the door on that. But if I don't decide to coach, I'd really like to stay involved in some capacity. And I told him, I was like, I'm going to pray about this, and I'm going to expect God to give me a crystal clear answer. And he did. And the door got shut on the coaching side of it. And before I could even say anything about what I wanted to do, he said, well, what do you think about being the team chaplain? I'm like, yeah, let's do it. So, all right, well, team meeting tomorrow night. I'll introduce you and we'll get going. Well, at that point, I had no idea, what we were going to do, but it's like, yes, okay, yes, God, here we go. And so the beautiful thing about that is these guys come from all over the country to Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and they're all in pursuit of their careers. I mean, they legitimately want to step up CFL, XFL, potentially NFL.
Yeah.
And so these guys come here for a reason, specifically to continue their careers, to make it to where they want to go. And so for me to come in there and be able to have those conversations from a relatable perspective of, yeah, guys, I was in your shoes. I played for the Storm for 3 years, coached for 10 years, helped coach Riggs out in multiple areas. And so my job as your team chaplain is to come in and just introduce faith to you and have these conversations about what it means to be a man of God. And we really talk mostly about leadership because some of those guys may not have a faith to them, and that's okay. And so we really get into leadership talk and conversation, and we get into prayer and Bible talk and things like that. But some guys want to take a different directions. But we feel like our central point of that ministry work we do there is revolving around leadership and going through the identity crisis, because every one of those guys, they come in here as a football player, and that's sometimes it. there is no plan. Just like when I was there, they don't have that next step. They don't have the future figured out. They don't have a 5-year plan. They are a football player and that's it. So some of those guys get hurt, that gets taken away. Some of those guys get cut, that gets taken away. So we try to hit right away on their significance, how they're created, and just talking about the plan that God has for them and making sure that's very crystal clear and evident right away, because week to week I go there and that team shifts, changes. Guys get cut, guys get traded, new guys are coming in, so you never know how long they're going to be there. But it's just radical that oftentimes thinking back to where I was as a player for the Storm to now coming back in the position I'm in, I mean, you can't write that. It's so surreal that I would ever come up with that on my own. Like, this is what I want to do. This is not what I wanted to do. This is what God wanted to do. And I knew that, as a volunteer team chaplain, that was going to take a lot of time, a lot of effort, and just a lot of things I was going to have to put together that started simply as being a team chaplain to then moving into mission, vision, values of what's now Storm Leadership Ministry, which is not a 501c3 or nonprofit, but I just felt like that needed to take place to really give it structure, to really give these guys a kind of strategic guidance through what God had put on my heart, to then lay it on paper and say, for those of you interested, this is what we're going to talk about, and it's just been a blessing in my heart too, of like what I've learned through that process. And again, getting to know these guys and their stories and their journeys, where they've been and where they're trying to get to. Because the one thing about the Sioux Falls Storm that's been pretty amazing is a lot of these guys, the first thing they do when they find out they're coming to the Storm is they have to look out Sioux Falls, South Dakota on a map. Like, where is Sioux Falls, South Dakota? And it's just been a blessing to our community, the guys that have ended up staying here. And I think that God has a plan for the guys to come in here, and they don't even know it yet. And I think it's so cool to see how one of the things we talk about is we want to get them connected to the church, we want to get it connected to the community, we want to get them connected to their calling. So part of the ministry is getting them out into the community and get them connected to career paths and kind of starting to identify those things. But they get hooked. Sioux Falls is a great community, and they've got great opportunities for young professionals and people that really meet a need for our community and just leadership.
I love that, I think that you are able to, because of the road that you've traveled, right? I mean, you understand what it is to be a player. You understand what it is to be a coach. You understand what it is to be, an aging player, where, a lot of those guys, I know that when I talk to the USF football team, towards the end of the season, I say, the reality is that for some of you guys, this is going to be the last time you put on a football helmet. And their world has been completely revolved around that, much like yours did. And so then for you to be able to say, look, I've been there. Here's what was going on in my head and my heart, and you're able to talk with them at the level that they're like, well, I'll listen to this dude because he knows where I am, because he's been where I am. And all of us have those types of things. We all have things in our life that if we allow God to use, he'll use them. So, I mean, I think there's a message in there for each one of us, and thinking back on, okay, so as I look back on my life, here are experiences that I've had, here's talents I have, here's things, the road that I've traveled. How could God potentially use the road that I've traveled to be a part of his work today? And that's what you're doing. You're doing it not because, like, you just use the word volunteer. It's a volunteer thing, but you're saying, okay, this is a way that I can be used in a way that is meaningful. And while it is definitely, I'm sure, meaningful for those guys, like you said, it fills you up. When we're in service to God, all of a sudden we realize, wow, we get some benefits out of that because we're utilizing the skills and the gifts and the passions that God has placed within us for the greater good and for the kingdom.
Oh, it's so true. And I always tell the guys, like, listen, if I could do this full time, I would do it in a heartbeat, because serving in this role of letting God kind of filter through me out to you guys is the greatest fulfillment I could ever do in my entire life. And I think that when we look at our lives and where I had this disbelief that God could use me, and then I finally just said, okay, God, what do you want to do with me? What is your will? To then let that just naturally flow out. I didn't have to do anything. Like I said, I didn't create these things. God just used what I already had in my toolbox and said, okay, let's get the tools out and let's just go to work.
Yeah.
And that's what he did.
Yeah, that's so good. That's so good, Joe. Well, brother, this has been a lot of fun just to connect in this way. And, we usually end our podcast with something. I didn't warn you this was coming up, but we usually end our podcast with something we call the final word. 30, 60, 90 seconds of whatever the Lord lays on your heart is kind of a final thought, final challenge, encouragement for listeners. And, could be a scripture that's meaningful to you or whatever, So I'd love for us to just end our time with just, the final word. And what's the final word that you have for those that have joined us on the podcast?
Yeah. I just think back, like in our conversation this moment, the thing that came up in my heart is just, we can't put limitations on what God can do with us based on our own beliefs. And I think that was something where I really struggled for a while, because the evolution of faith is the maturity side of it, right? And so once we accept Jesus and the Holy Spirit comes in and just moves in our life, like he'll take things away from us that we don't even have to try. We have to be obedient, we have to be committed, but the way the Holy Spirit works and just moves, we can't limit that. And I think for so many years, I just put a limit on it. I shut the door in certain areas. And then finally, John Simchenko, I just said, listen, John, for the rest of my life, I'm not telling God no anymore. I'm just not. So you throw something at me, I'm going to say yes. All right, we'll come preach my service this Sunday. Okay. Yeah, you just challenged me, so I guess I got to do it. But for real, like just saying yes to God. Yeah. And what can he do? Like you don't know until you give that up to him. Oh, that's so good. Well, Joe, thank you. Thank you for joining me today, and really appreciate your friendship and sharing this time and more of your story with us. And this was a great encouragement to me today, and I know it is for listeners as well. So really appreciate you. Oh, yeah, it was fun, Tom. Thanks for having me. Well, that's a wrap on this episode, friends. Thanks for listening to the conversation I had with Joe Evenson. If you enjoyed our conversation or found it helpful, I encourage you to share it with others that may find it helpful as well. If you'd like to connect more with Joe, you can do so at wish.org/SDMT. Also, before you move on to what's next, it would mean a ton if you would take 30 seconds to rate and or review the podcast, as that is such an easy way to help us grow both our audience and our impact. All right, thanks again for joining me today, everybody. We'll see you next time for another episode of the RESGEN Giving Life Podcast. Until then, continue being men whose life in Christ gives life to others.